The noon train screamed into Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory on the 14th of April, 1882, trailing a plume of black smoke that curled against a sky so blue it looked painted. And it carried on its last passenger car a woman who had nothing but a single leather satchel, a name that may or may not have been real, and a pair of green eyes that held the particular kind of stillness you only find in people who have survived something they cannot speak of. Tobias Conroy stood on the platform with one boot propped against a post and a telegram folded in the breast pocket of his worn duster. A telegram he had read 6 times since breakfast and still could not fully accept. The telegram was from his brother Ellis, and it said in plain economical words that the Conroy family ranch was going to the bank by the 1st of May unless Tobias returned to deal with debts that Ellis, bless his overworked heart, could not handle alone. Tobias had been meaning to ride back north to the ranch for 3 months. He kept finding reasons not to. The truth was that the ranch reminded him of his father, who was 2 years gone, and his mother, who was 4 years gone, and a version of himself he had not been able to locate since either of them died. He was 28 years old and felt considerably older, with calloused hands and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 days and dark eyes that had been described variously by the people of Dusty Creek as dangerous, sad, and, by the postmistress Mrs. Aldridge, as the loneliest things she had ever seen on a living man. He was not on the platform to meet anyone. He was there because the station had a covered roof, and it was already warm enough in mid-April that a man appreciated shade, and because he could hear the train from the saloon where he had been nursing a single glass of rye since 10 o'clock without drinking it, and the sound of the train always did something to him, some small lifting of the chest, the sense of elsewhere, the sense that the world was larger than whatever corner of it currently held him. The train hissed and groaned and came to a stop in a great exhalation of steam, and the conductor stepped down first, and then 2 ranchers from the northern territories, and then an older couple with matching luggage, and then the platform was quiet for a moment, and Tobias was already pushing off the post to leave when the last passenger door opened. She stepped down onto the platform in a dark blue dress that had been pressed at some point in the recent past, and had since been somewhat crumpled by travel. She wore a hat with a single burgundy ribbon, and the hat was tilted at an angle that suggested she had adjusted it hastily. The leather satchel she carried was not heavy, he could tell by the way she held it, and her other hand held onto the railing of the train step just a half-second longer than necessary, as if she were steadying herself for something that had nothing to do with her balance. She stepped fully onto the platform and looked at the town of Dusty Creek with the expression of someone cataloging an escape route. Then her heel caught the uneven plank at the edge of the platform, the one that old Cecil from the station had been meaning to fix for 2 winters running, and she went sideways, the satchel swinging out, and Tobias Conroy moved without deciding to move, crossing the platform in 3 strides and catching her by the elbow and the waist before she hit the ground. For a moment they were close enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes, which was not simply green but rather the color of sage after rain, gray-green and complex, and they were wide with surprise. And then, as she found her footing, they narrowed into something considerably more composed. "I had it," she said. "You did not," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then, because there was nothing else to say to that, she straightened her hat. "Thank you. The plank is loose," he said. "I should have warned you." "You did not know I was coming," she said. "I did not," he agreed. He let go of her elbow. He kept his other hand at her waist a half-second longer than necessary and then withdrew it too. Tobias Conroy. She looked at him in the way that people look at a hand extended across a distance they are not sure they want to cross. Then she took his hand and shook it, brief and businesslike. Ruby Beckett. The name fell between them like a coin dropped on a hard floor, clear and final. He did not know why it struck him that way. He did not know anything about her. She was a woman who had stepped off a train and nearly fallen, and he had caught her and she had told him her name, That was all. "Is anyone meeting you?" he asked. "No," she said. "Do you know the town?" "I do not," she said. She looked down the main street of Dusty Creek, which was composed of a hardware store, a saloon, a general store, a church, a hotel called the Dusty Creek Inn, a barber shop, a livery, and a scattering of houses behind and around these things like shy children hiding behind their parents. "Is there a boarding house?" "The inn," he said, nodding toward it. "Mrs. Hartwell runs it. Clean rooms, and she does not ask questions." Ruby Beckett looked at him when he said that last part, and something moved in those sage-green eyes, something that might have been relief or might have been calculation or might have been both at once. "That sounds adequate," she said. "I can walk you over," he said. "The main street has 2 other loose planks and a drainage ditch that is not well marked." She almost smiled. It happened at the corner of her mouth and then was gone. "Are you the town's official danger guide, Mr. Conroy?" "Not officially," he said. "I just spend a lot of time walking around it." That was how it began. He walked her across the main street of Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the bright spring of 1882, stepping over the drainage ditch and steering wide of the second loose plank. And she walked beside him with her satchel and her secrets, and that almost smile that appeared and disappeared like a bird landing briefly on a branch. He got her settled with Mrs. Hartwell, who was a wide, comfortable woman of 50, who took one look at Ruby Beckett and tucked her under her wing the way she did with everyone who arrived looking like they needed tucking. Ruby paid for a week in advance with folded bills from inside her satchel, which told Tobias, watching from the doorway, that she had some money but not excess of it, and that she was not planning to stay longer than a week, or she was not letting herself plan that far. He tipped his hat to both women and walked back out into the April sunlight thinking that he would not think about her again. He thought about her for the rest of the afternoon. He ate supper at the saloon, which was called the Red Acre, and which served food as an afterthought to the liquor and the card games, and he sat at the bar with a plate of beans and salt pork and found himself watching the door. She did not come in, which made sense, since it was not the kind of place a woman newly arrived in a town would go for supper. She would stay at the inn, where Mrs. Hartwell served a table at 6, and she would eat and go to her room, and he had no reason to think about her at all. "You are looking at that door like it owes you something," said Denny Marsh from 2 stools over. Denny was 45, lean as a fence post, and worked at the livery. He had the particular gift of noticing things that other people preferred he did not notice. "I am not looking at any door," Tobias said. "Woman who came in on the noon train," Denny said. "Dark blue dress. Mrs. Hartwell is already calling her a treasure, which is what she calls everyone she likes, but I am told she actually means it this time." "I helped her off the platform," Tobias said. "That is all." "That plank," Denny said, nodding wisely. "That plank," Tobias agreed. There was a silence. Tobias ate his beans. "She is looking for work," Denny said. "I heard her ask Mrs. Hartwell if anyone in town needed a skilled hand. Hartwell told her to try the general store." Tobias set down his fork. "What kind of work?" Denny shrugged. "Did not specify from what I heard." He finished his supper and walked back to his rented room above the saddle maker's shop, which was where he had been living for 3 months since he came through Dusty Creek on his way from one place to another and somehow stopped moving. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and took out the telegram from Ellis and read it for the 7th time. The ranch was 5 days' ride north. It was 160 acres of New Mexico grassland that his father had broken his body building, and his mother had broken her heart loving, and it was being eaten by debt the same way everything good eventually got eaten by something in this part of the world. Ellis could not manage it alone. He was 24 years old and good with cattle and bad with numbers, and he had written the telegram in a way that did not ask but that unmistakably needed. Tobias should have already left. He should have been riding north 3 months ago when he first came through and got stuck in Dusty Creek for reasons he could not clearly articulate even to himself. There was no reason to stay. And yet here he was, sitting on a narrow bed reading a telegram for the 7th time, thinking about a woman with sage-green eyes who had nearly fallen off the platform of this town that neither of them seemed to know what to do with. He put the telegram away and lay down with his boots on and stared at the ceiling and told himself he would leave in the morning. He did not leave in the morning. He woke early, as he always did, and saddled his horse, a bay mare named Calla, and rode out to the eastern edge of town, where the land opened up into grass and scrub, and the sky went on forever. And he sat on Calla's back for a long time watching the sun come up and thinking about his father and about Ellis, and about the ranch, and about whether a man who had spent 3 months in a town doing essentially nothing of value could really call himself a functioning person. He rode back at 7:30 and nearly ran into Ruby Beckett, who was walking down the center of the main street with her hat firmly on her head and her boots planted like she owned the ground she was covering, which was a different posture entirely from the woman who had caught the platform railing 24 hours ago. She saw him and stopped. He reined Calla in. "Good morning, Mr. Conroy," she said. "Good morning," he said. He looked at the direction she was heading, which was toward the general store. "Opening time is 8, he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to be first in line." He looked at the empty street, which did not have a line on it. She lifted her chin in a way that acknowledged this without conceding anything. "The owner is Garrett Hollies," Tobias said. "He is not an easy man. He thinks he is more important than he is, and he pays women less than men for the same work, which he will tell you is not what he is doing." She looked at him steadily. "Is there somewhere else to look for work?" "There is a dressmaker on the south end, Mrs. Fay. She does alterations and makes to order. I do not know if she needs help, but she is a fairer person." He paused. "There is also the schoolteacher situation." Ruby Beckett's eyes sharpened. "What schoolteacher situation?" "The school lost its teacher in February. She married a man from Santa Fe and went south with him. The town council has been arguing ever since about what to do. I believe the children have been taking turns being taught by whoever can be convinced, which is not a system anyone is satisfied with." He tilted his head. "Do you have teaching experience?" She was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone deciding how much to say. "I can read and write and cipher, and I have some history and geography." "I have some experience with children." Another pause. "I did not have an official position." "The town council meets every other Friday," he said. "This is Thursday. You could present yourself tomorrow." She looked at him in a way that was measuring and not unfriendly. "You know a great deal about this town for someone who does not seem to be from it." He almost smiled. "I have been here 3 months with very little to do. You learn things." "Why are you still here?" she asked. It was direct without apology for being direct, and he found that he did not mind it. "I am not sure," he said honestly. She nodded, as if that answer was more satisfying than a rehearsed one would have been. "Thank you for the advice about the school. I will find the council." She walked off toward the general store anyway, because she was thorough, and he watched her go and then turned Calla toward the livery. The town council of Dusty Creek consisted of 5 men. Mayor Jerome Pickett, who was round and self-satisfied. Councilman Walt Feeney, who was thin and nervous. Councilman Dale Ruiz, whose family had been in New Mexico for 100 years, and who was the most sensible of the group. Councilman Ben Orm, who was the owner of the Red Acre Saloon and who attended meetings primarily to obstruct. And Councilman Harold Graves, who was elderly and often fell asleep but whose vote counted the same as anyone's. They met in the back room of the hardware store on Friday mornings, which Tobias knew because he had been conscripted 2 months ago to fix the hardware store's roof, and had been doing odd jobs for people around town ever since as his primary means of not thinking about his future. He did not attend the council meeting. He was on top of a fence at the south paddock of the livery, replacing boards, when he saw Ruby Beckett walk past toward the hardware store in her blue dress, this time with her hair pinned up more carefully and her hat carried in her hand rather than on her head. He watched her go and kept hammering and told himself it was nothing to do with him. An hour later she walked back past and he was still on the fence. "Well," he said. She stopped and looked up at him. There was a particular brightness in her face that had not been there the day before, and it did something to his chest that he decided not to examine immediately. "They offered me the position. 3 months trial. $30 a month, which is less than the man who had the job before me got." "What did he get?" 45, she said. "According to Mrs. Fay, who I stopped to ask on my way." "That is not right," he said. "It is not," she agreed, in the tone of someone who is not surprised. "But it is more than nothing, and it is a reason to stay." She said that last part as if she was telling herself as much as him, as if she had been carrying a question about whether to stay or go, and this had tipped it. He climbed down from the fence and brushed sawdust from his hands. "The schoolhouse is on the north end," he said. "There are about 14 children, ages 6 to 14. Some of them can already read. A few of them are the particular kind of trouble that children become when they have had 4 months of inconsistent teaching." "I can manage trouble," she said. He believed her. The first week passed in the way that weeks pass in small towns, slowly and with great attention to detail. Tobias became aware of Ruby Beckett's presence in Dusty Creek, the way you become aware of a new sound in a familiar room, not intrusive but impossible to stop noticing. He saw her in the mornings walking to the schoolhouse, sometimes with a stack of books borrowed from the small town library that was housed in the back of the church. He saw her on her lunch hour at the general store, where she had apparently negotiated with Garrett Hollies a small ongoing account, having gone over his head to his wife Martha, who ran the store's books and was considerably more practical than her husband. He saw her in the evenings sometimes on the front porch of the inn, sitting with Mrs. Hartwell, and once reading alone with a lamp lit behind her that cast her in warm gold against the spring dark. He did not manufacture reasons to speak to her. He was careful about that. But Dusty Creek was small enough, and his daily circuits of it were habitual enough that their paths crossed naturally and often, and each time they spoke a little more than the last. He learned that she could make strong opinions out of very few words. He learned that she had a humor that appeared sideways, in observations rather than jokes. He learned that she was good with the children because Mrs. Hartwell reported it, and because he could hear, passing the schoolhouse at midday, a quality of noise inside that was not chaos but engagement, which was different. He did not learn where she was from. He did not learn what she had left. He could feel the edges of those things the way you feel the edge of a hole in a floor in a dark room, the air different over it, the ground absent where ground should be. She was careful around those edges. He respected careful. She learned things about him, too, in the slow accumulation of spring days. She learned that he was capable and reliable with his hands, which she observed from the evidence of his work around town. She learned that he drank sparingly and gambled occasionally at the Red Acre on quiet evenings, but was not defined by either. She learned, from Mrs. Hartwell, who could not tell you things, that he had a brother and a ranch up north, and a sadness about him that the older woman described as something he was carrying without knowing where to put down. On the 15th day after she arrived, Ruby Beckett stopped Tobias Conroy on the street in the early evening and said, without preamble, "There is a loose board in the schoolhouse floor that I have been working around for 2 weeks. I was told you do carpentry work." "I do," he said. "What do you charge?" He thought about it. "Supper," he said, "Mrs. Hartwell's table." She looked at him for a moment with those complicated eyes. "You are going to fix a floor for supper at a place you could eat any evening if you wanted." "I like company," he said, which was only partially true but not false either. The truer thing was that he liked her company specifically, which he was not yet prepared to say aloud. She said, "All right, tomorrow evening." He fixed the floor on Saturday morning, which he did not tell her, and then showed up on Saturday evening for supper at the inn, and Ruby Beckett sat across from him at Mrs. Hartwell's long table while the older woman served roast chicken and good bread, and pretended not to be watching them with the satisfaction of a woman who has engineered something. They talked through supper about the children in the school, which was easy ground, and then about the town, and then, edging toward harder territory, about the landscape, the way the territory opened up east of town into something that felt like the beginning of forever. "Have you been west before?" she asked. "Born here," he said. "New Mexico. The ranch is up by the Sangre de Cristo foothills." "It sounds beautiful," she said. The words were careful, not wistful. He noticed she did not offer where she was from in return. He said, "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to tell me." She looked up from her plate. He was not sure what he expected. Gratitude, maybe, or the brief shuddering of those eyes. What he got instead was something rawer, a flash of something genuine, surprised, like a person who has been holding their breath and did not realize someone had noticed. "Most people ask," she said. "Most people think asking is their right," he said. "I do not agree." She was quiet for a moment. "I came from Kansas," she said. "From a town called Linden. I left in February." She said nothing more, and he did not ask more, and the space between those sentences held everything that mattered and nothing he was entitled to. "February was cold," he said. "You made good time." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I did." They finished supper. Mrs. Hartwell brought out a pie that she claimed was an accident, and it was not an accident at all, and they ate it with the comfortable ease of people who have begun to not need to fill every silence. Walking her to the staircase afterward, in the narrow hallway of the inn with its smell of wood polish and old cooking, he said, "There is a dance next Saturday. The town holds them once a month in the spring." Outside, weather permitting, she stopped at the foot of the stairs. "Are you asking me to go with you?" He realized that he had not planned to be. "I am asking if you are going," he said, which was a version of the same thing. She smiled at him, real and full, and it was the first time he had seen the whole of it, and it was entirely worth the waiting. "I am going," she said. "I suppose I will see you there, Mr. Conroy." "Tobias," he said. "Ruby," she said. April deepened into May, and the land around Dusty Creek turned the particular vivid green that high desert grass manages for exactly a few weeks before the summer heat turns it back to gold, and something between Tobias and Ruby deepened alongside it. The dance happened on a Saturday night, warm enough that the bonfire they lit was more festive than necessary, throwing orange light across the cleared dirt square behind the church where someone had hung paper lanterns between the fence posts. The town's fiddle player, an old man called Perkins who claimed to have played in St. Louis before some trouble he never specified brought him west, stood on a barrel and made music that was not technically perfect but was entirely feeling. Tobias had cleaned up for the occasion, which he noted did not go unremarked by Denny Marsh, who said, "You shaved," with the particular delight of a man watching something he predicted come true. Ruby arrived with Mrs. Hartwell, wearing a dress that was not the blue one but a deep red that Tobias suspected was the other dress in her satchel, the one she had saved. Her hair was down, which he had not seen before, dark and long past her shoulders, and she had done something with it at the temples that made it partly swept back, and it was simple, and it was something he was going to have difficulty forgetting. He crossed to her before he had time to think about whether he was being too obvious, and Mrs. Hartwell took one look at his face and murmured something about punch and disappeared. "You look well," he said. It was insufficient, and he knew it. "You shaved," she said, which told him she had noticed before on the days he had not. They danced. He was not a skilled dancer, but he was sure on his feet, and she was light, and they figured each other out through 2 songs. And by the third they were moving together without thinking about it, her hand in his and the other at her waist, and the bonfire and the lanterns and old Perkins on his barrel and the rest of Dusty Creek circling around them ceased to be particularly relevant. "I like this town," she said, during the 3rd song, and the way she said it was not casual. It was the sound of someone surprised by their own admission. "I do too," he said, which was also a surprise to him, since he had been planning to leave it since the day he arrived. She leaned back enough to look at him. Firelight did things to her face. "Why are you still here, Tobias? You have a ranch, you have a brother who needs you." He had told her about Ellis, about the telegram, about the bank, and the accumulation of their conversations over the weeks. He had not told her how close the deadline was. "The 1st of May," he said. "Ellis has until the 1st of May." It was the 24th of April. Something moved in her expression. "That is a week," she said. 7 days, he agreed. "You should go," she said. Her voice was steady, and it cost her something he could see if he looked. "I know," he said. They stopped dancing, or rather they had slowed to barely moving, and the music went on around them and people went on around them, and they stood in the middle of it looking at each other with the particular awareness of two people who have arrived simultaneously at something they are not sure they are ready for. "I am afraid," he said, and the words came out before he fully chose them, "that if I leave I will not come back." "Why would you not come back?" she asked, and the question was careful and not small. "Because I have not been able to go back to the ranch in 2 years," he said. "Because every time I get close to it in my mind I think about who is not there anymore and I find somewhere else to be. Dusty Creek was the latest somewhere else." She looked at him for a long time. "And now it does not feel like somewhere else," he said. "Now it feels like somewhere." The music wound to a close and Perkins started a new song faster, and around them people clapped and the dance shifted. Ruby and Tobias stood still in it. "Go to your brother," she said quietly. "Help him with the ranch. Do what your father built needs you to do." "And then," he said, she looked at him steadily. "And then come back," she said. "If you want to, come back." He left on the morning of April 26th, which gave him 5 days to ride north and reach the ranch, which was enough if he pushed Calla and the weather held. He said goodbye to Ruby on the front steps of the inn before the town was awake. She was in her ordinary clothes and her hair was up again and the morning light was still gray and thin, and she handed him a wrapped piece of bread and cheese that Mrs. Hartwell had made for the road, which meant Mrs. Hartwell was awake and aware and had chosen not to come to the door herself. "I will write when I arrive," he said. "I would like that," she said. She held his gaze. There was something in her face that was not quite fear but was in the same neighborhood, the look of someone who has trusted the ground before and felt it give. He wanted very much to close the distance between them, and he wanted, even more, not to start something he was going to have to finish from the back of a horse over 5 days. So instead he took her hand and pressed it briefly, the way that meant more than a handshake and less than a promise, and she pressed back, and then he let go. He rode north through the sage and the red rock and the wide spring sky, and he thought about her the entire first day and most of the second. And on the third day he thought about his father, which hurt in a way he had been avoiding for 2 years. And on the fourth day he thought about both of them. And somewhere in the middle of the fifth day, coming down from a long slope toward the grass and the familiar cottonwoods of the Conroy ranch, he found that the grief was still there, but it was not a wall anymore. It was something he was carrying. It was the difference between a weight that pins you and a weight you walk with. Ellis came out of the house at the sound of Calla's hooves. He was tall like Tobias but rangier, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and he stood on the porch and his expression when he saw his brother was the particular expression of someone who has been holding something up alone for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. "You are here," Ellis said. "I am here," Tobias said, and dismounted. They did not embrace because they were Conroy men and that was not the way of it, but they stood close for a moment, and Ellis put a hand on his brother's shoulder and Tobias put a hand briefly on Ellis's, and that was the way of it, and it was enough. The situation with the bank was worse than the telegram suggested, and better than Tobias had feared after 5 days of imagining it. There were 2 loans taken on the property, one from the bank in Cimarron and one personal debt to a man named Harlan Tate who had lent their father money for cattle 4 years ago. The bank loan was manageable if they sold a portion of the north pasture, which Tobias did not want to do but could accept. The debt to Tate was more complicated because Tate was not a simple creditor. Harlan Tate arrived on the second day Tobias was at the ranch, and he was not what Tobias expected, which was a rough man. He was instead a neat man in his 50s with good boots and the kind of manners that are more menacing than rudeness. He wanted the cattle as payment in lieu of cash, all 40 head, which would have left the ranch unable to function as a working operation. Tobias sat across a table from Harlan Tate and negotiated for 2 hours with the steady, methodical stubbornness of a man who has nothing to lose and knows it, and they arrived at a number that was more than half the cattle but not all of them, and a payment schedule on the remainder that Ellis could meet from the proceeds of the South herd. Tate was not pleased. He was also not going to take the trouble of legal action for a debt that was now being paid. He took his hat and his neat boots and his pleasant menace and left. Ellis said afterward, "Where did you learn to do that?" Tobias thought about it. "I do not know," he said, and then, because he was thinking about where he had spent the last 3 months, "I think I have been practicing being patient." He stayed 2 weeks. They went to Cimarron together and spoke to the bank, and the partial sale of the north pasture was arranged, and the loan restructured with terms that were survivable. They repaired the west fence together, working shoulder to shoulder in the warm May sun, and in the evenings Ellis cooked because he had discovered he was good at it, which would have surprised their father and would not have surprised their mother, and they talked about her in a way they had not since she died, about the things she used to say, and the way she used to make the house smell like something warm and purposeful. On the 5th evening Tobias told Ellis about Ruby Beckett. He did not plan to. They were sitting on the porch after supper with coffee, watching the dark come down over the grassland, and Ellis asked if there was anything in Dusty Creek worth going back to, and Tobias said there was one thing and then found himself saying considerably more than that. Ellis listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when he was paying real attention. When Tobias finished, Ellis said, "She told you to come back." "She did. And you want to?" "I do." Ellis looked out at the dark grassland. "Then go back," he said. "This place will still be here. I will still be here. Go back and do not let yourself run out of reasons." Tobias looked at his younger brother, who was sometimes considerably wiser than his 24 years, and said, "The ranch will manage," Ellis said firmly. "I will hire someone for the branding. The bank situation is sorted. Go back, Tobias." He left on a Tuesday morning in mid-May, and the grass was already going from green to gold in the way it did when the season shifted, and he had a package in his saddlebag for Ruby that he had found in the general store in Cimarron, a small book of illustrated wildflowers of the Southwest, because she had mentioned once in passing that she did not know the names of the desert flowers and she would like to. He had thought about that for 7 days before he bought the book, and he did not examine that fact too closely. The ride back to Dusty Creek took the same 5 days. The weather broke on the 3rd day, and he rode through rain for half of it, and Calla was a stalwart and forgiving horse about the whole thing. He arrived in Dusty Creek on a Friday evening, muddy and tired and unreasonably pleased to see the familiar badly marked drainage ditch and the uneven planks of the main street. He took Calla to the livery, and Denny Marsh looked at him with the satisfaction of a man who expected exactly this and said not a word. Tobias walked to the inn and knocked on the front door. Mrs. Hartwell opened it, took one look at him, and said, "She is at the schoolhouse. She stays late on Fridays to prepare for the next week." He walked to the north end of town in the fading May evening. The schoolhouse was a small wooden building, 1 room, with 2 windows on either side that let the last of the light in. Through one window he could see a lamp burning and a figure at the teacher's desk, bent over papers. He knocked on the door. There was a pause, and then footsteps, and the door opened, and Ruby Beckett stood in the doorway with chalk dust on her fingers, and a slightly startled expression that shifted immediately into something she tried to compose and did not entirely manage. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You are muddy," she said. "It rained," he said. She stepped back to let him in, and he came into the small, warm, lamplit room that smelled of chalk and paper and the particular slightly dusty smell of children's accumulated days. There were drawings on the wall that the children had done, and a map of the territories, and the multiplication tables written in a careful hand that he recognized as hers. He set the package on her desk. She looked at it and then at him. "What is this?" she said. "Something I saw in Cimarron," he said. "You mentioned the flowers." She opened it. She looked at the illustrated cover, the careful botanical drawings inside, the way each plant had its common name and its Latin name and a description of where it grew and what season it bloomed. She ran her thumb along the edge of the pages. "Tobias," she said, and stopped. "It is not a large thing," he said quickly. "It is a large thing," she said quietly. She looked up. "You remembered." "I remember most of what you say," he said, and that came out more honestly than he had intended, and he saw the effect of it on her face, the careful composure softening. She set the book on the desk. She looked at him in the lamplit room with the chalk dust on her fingers and said, "I should tell you something. I have been thinking about it the whole time you were gone, and I think if I do not say it now I will find another reason not to." "All right," he said. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked, for the first time since he had known her, like she was not sure of the ground beneath her. "The name," she said. "Ruby Beckett. My name is Ruby. Beckett was my husband's name." He was quiet. He waited. "He died," she said. "Just over a year ago. He was not a good man." She paused, choosing words with care. "He was violent, and I stayed too long, and when he died I was not sorry, and I have spent the last year deciding whether that makes me a terrible person." She met his eyes. "I do not think it does. But I came here with his name because it was the only name that was on the papers that mattered, and I needed those papers to travel. And I came here because nowhere anyone knew either of us was close enough to matter." The silence in the room was full but not uncomfortable. A moth found the lamp and began its small, frantic orbit. "You are not a terrible person," Tobias said. She let out a breath. "You do not know that." "I know enough," he said. "I have watched you with 14 children for a month. I have seen how you talk to Mrs. Hartwell and how you handle Garrett Hollies and how you walk through this town. I know enough." She looked at him for a long time. The moth circled. The lamp was steady. "I am afraid," she said, "of being someone a man has authority over. I am afraid of that more than I have been afraid of most things." He nodded. That was a weight she was carrying, and he was not going to pretend he did not understand what it meant. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you for authority. I am not asking you for anything tonight. I just came back because you told me to." She laughed, and it was the real laugh he had been waiting for since the day on the platform, full and unguarded, and the sound of it was the best thing he had heard in a long time. "Sit down," she said. "I have to finish these papers, and then I am going to Mrs. Hartwell's for supper, and you are probably hungry, which you should be after 5 days of riding in the rain, so you can sit in that chair and not bother me while I finish, and then we will walk back together." He sat in the chair in the corner, which was a child's chair and too small for him, and she went back to her papers, and the lamp burned and the moth circled, and outside the May dark came fully down over Dusty Creek, New Mexico, and Tobias Conroy sat in a too small chair, feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, which was exactly where he was supposed to be. June arrived with heat that settled over the territory like a patient animal, and with it came the longer days and the particular rhythms of a small town in summer, the livestock restless, the children fidgety in the schoolhouse, the men of the town congregating in the shade of the Red Acre awning in the afternoons, while the women ran the actual machinery of the place. Tobias had stopped staying in the room above the saddle maker and moved into a small house on the south end of town that belonged to an older rancher named Fowler, who had gone to stay with his daughter in Santa Fe for the summer and needed someone to keep the place from deteriorating in his absence. It was not much: a main room, a kitchen, a sleeping room, a porch facing west, but it had a proper table and a working stove, and a view of the sun going down over the scrub hills that Tobias found himself watching most evenings. He and Ruby spent their time together in the particular way of two people who are being careful with each other, and are also, both of them, aware that the carefulness is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. They walked together in the evenings. They ate supper at Mrs. Hartwell's table most Fridays. On Sundays, they sometimes rode out east of town, Ruby on a borrowed mare from the livery that Denny Marsh started saddling automatically once he understood the pattern, and they rode through the territory with the wildflower book in Ruby's saddlebag and stopped when she saw something she could not identify, which happened often because the desert in June was extraordinary. The prickly pear in bloom, the yucca standing tall with its white candles, the scarlet ocotillo like something on fire. She was not a confident rider. She had learned as a girl and then stopped and then learned again, and the gap showed. But she was determined, and she did not ask him to slow down for her, and he calibrated their pace without making it obvious, which he thought she probably noticed anyway. He had written to Ellis twice since his return, and Ellis had written back, once with news of the cattle, and once with a shorter note that consisted mostly of variations on the question of when Tobias was planning to come home again, and whether the woman in Dusty Creek was the reason the answer kept being not yet. Tobias wrote back that the ranch could do with some looking at in the fall when the work season shifted, and that yes, he supposed it was. One evening in late June, he told Ruby about his parents. Not the grief of losing them, which he had touched on before, but the actual people. His mother, who had taught herself French from a book and could name most of the constellations, and who baked bread every Thursday that you could smell from the east fence. And his father, who was a hard man in many ways and a stubborn man, and had also been occasionally surprising in his gentleness. Who had cried privately when their dog died, and who kept a letter from his own mother in the locked box in his desk that Tobias had only seen once. Ruby listened to all of it in the way she listened when she was fully present, which was different from the way she listened when she was being polite. When he finished, she said, "Your father sounds like someone who had more inside than he knew how to show." "Yes," Tobias said, "exactly that. My father was similar," she said, and then, which surprised him because she was still careful with her past, he was a minister in Ohio, very proper, very much concerned with what things looked like from the outside. But I once saw him give the last of our winter flour to a family that had come through with nothing, and he did not mention it to anyone. He just did it." She paused. "I do not know if he was a good man overall. I think he was a complicated one. He approved of my marriage to Beckett because Beckett appeared respectable, and he never asked me after if I was all right." Tobias said nothing for a moment because there was nothing small enough to say that would fit, and then he said, "I am sorry he did not ask." She looked at the horizon, which was the amber and violet of a late June dusk. "I stopped waiting for him to," she said. "I stopped waiting for a lot of people. I started doing things for myself." She turned and looked at Tobias. "That is not a tragedy, it is just something that happened." "No," he agreed. "It is not a tragedy, it is how you became the person you are." She looked at him in the way that made him aware of his own heartbeat. "You say things like that," she said, "and I do not know what to do with them." "You do not have to do anything with them," he said. "They are just true." They were sitting on the porch of Fowler's house, side by side, and the last of the sun was going out of the sky. The evening star had appeared. She was close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her beside him, and he thought about the dance and the firelight and the way they had moved together, and about the schoolhouse in May and the moth around the lamp, and about all the days since then that had added up into something he did not have a name for yet but could feel the shape of. He turned toward her. She had been looking at the sky and now looked at him, and in the last of the evening light she was very much the most real thing in his field of vision. He said, "Ruby," and she said, "Yes." And then he leaned forward and kissed her, and it was quiet and careful, and it was the most significant thing he had done in a long time. She kissed him back. It was not desperate or overwhelming. It was the kind of kiss that has been building for 2 months and arrives finally like the answer to a question both people have been asking. When they separated, she looked at him very carefully, studying his face with those complicated eyes. Whatever she found there appeared to satisfy her, because she settled back in her chair and looked at the evening star and let out a long, slow breath. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again. with the specific emphasis of a woman who has made a decision she feels good about. July in Dusty Creek was fierce and bright and relentless, and the town moved slower in the heat but did not stop, because a frontier town that stopped was a town that died, and Dusty Creek was stubbornly alive. The children endured their lessons in the heated schoolhouse with varying degrees of grace, and Ruby brought a bucket of water and tin cups every morning. And Tobias, who had taken on more regular carpentry work for the town, and had acquired a modest reputation as a man who did good work, and showed up when he said he would, built a small awning over the south window of the schoolhouse on a Saturday in early July while the children were not there, so that the afternoon sun did not come directly in. He did not tell her he was doing it, he just did it. She found it Monday morning, and he was on the other side of town nailing boards when one of her students, a 10-year-old named Hector Ruiz, who was the youngest of Dale Ruiz's large family, came running across the main street to find him, and breathlessly delivered the message that the schoolteacher said to tell the man doing the carpentry work that the awning was very good and the windows were cooler. Tobias gave Hector a penny and Hector ran back. He and Ruby had fallen into a courtship that was entirely real and somewhat unmarked by formality, because they were both people who distrusted the formal versions of things in favor of the actual versions. They did not announce themselves. Dusty Creek announced them, because Dusty Creek was small and observant, and by the middle of July there was not a person in town who did not understand what was happening, and the general opinion ranged from approving to warmly approving, with a dissenting note from Garrett Hollies, who said he did not think a schoolteacher ought to be carrying on, which his wife Martha told him was none of his business, and that his own conduct was not past question. A remark whose context Tobias was never entirely clear on, but which ended Hollies's commentary on the subject. They talked about the future in the careful, oblique way of people who are falling in love, and are also both carrying things that make them cautious. Tobias wrote to Ellis and told him honestly that he did not think he was coming back to run the ranch full time, that his life appeared to be taking a different shape, and that he would come for fall and help with whatever was needed, but that Ellis should plan to run it and should look at taking on a partner if the workload needed it. Ellis wrote back, after a week that Tobias spent being anxious about what that meant, with a letter that said he had already thought as much, and that he had spoken to Dale Ruiz's oldest son Miguel about a working partnership, and that he was, and Tobias could hear the dry quality of his younger brother's voice in the phrasing, very much fine, and Tobias should stop worrying and get on with his life. Ruby's situation in Dusty Creek had solidified in ways that mattered. The town council, under some organized pressure from Mrs. Hartwell and Mrs. Fay and several of the other women of the town, had revisited her salary and moved it from $30 to $38, which was not the $45 the previous teacher had received but was closer, and came with the use of the schoolhouse for any additional classes she wanted to run. She had started an evening reading circle for the adults in town who wanted to improve their letters, which met on Wednesdays in the school, and had started with 6 people and grown to 11. She had sent away to Santa Fe for 3 additional textbooks and had them donated to the school library by the Women's Charitable Society that Mrs. Hartwell chaired with the efficient authority of a general. She was, in other words, building something here, and the building of it had given her face a quality that had not been there when she stepped off the noon train, something settled, something that was hers. On an evening in late July, very warm, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of Mrs. Hartwell's cold tea that Ruby had brought from the inn, Tobias said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer can be no, and that will not change anything between us." Ruby set down her cup and gave him her full attention, which meant she had put down whatever she was holding in her mind and was present. "Ask," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not right away if you do not want. Not in any way that makes you feel that I am taking something from you, on whatever terms make it real for you." She was very still. He could not read her face, and he made himself hold the uncertainty. "What terms are you thinking of?" she said finally. He had thought about this. "Your name stays yours," he said. "You continue your work as long as you want it. We live how we decide to live, not how other people think we should. I do not tell you what to do with your person or your time or your choices." He paused. "I just want to be in your life and have you in mine, the permanence of it." She looked at him for a long time. The evening insects were starting up in the scrub. The last orange light was going off the hills. "My name," she said carefully, "is not Beckett. That was his name. I do not know if I want to take another man's name." "Then do not," he said. "You can call yourself Ruby Conroy or Ruby Beckett or Ruby from Dusty Creek. I do not care about your name. I care about you." Something cracked open in her expression, not breaking but opening, like a window after a long winter. "I need you to understand," she said slowly, "that I spent years in a situation that I could not get out of easily, that I have worked very hard to be someone who belongs to herself, and that I love you." He felt those words move through him like warmth. "And that the loving you is not the frightening part," she continued. "The frightening part is trusting the structure of it, trusting that the legal fact of marriage does not change the person you are." "I understand," he said. "I cannot promise you the future perfectly. I can promise you who I am right now, and I can tell you that the person I am right now would never want to own you or diminish you or take anything from you." She was quiet for a moment. "I know that," she said. "I have watched you for 3.5 months, and I know that." Then he said, "Yes," she said. "Yes, Tobias." He exhaled. He had not known he was holding his breath. He reached across and took her hand, and she curled her fingers through his, and they sat in the last of the summer evening, and let it be what it was. They were married in October, which gave them 3 months to be simply themselves before the structure of the thing came in, and those 3 months were not wasted. They spent time in the ordinary way that builds real things, arguing once about whether the north window in Fowler's house needed replacing before Tobias negotiated to keep the property from Fowler outright at a price they could manage together, which led to a longer and more significant conversation about money and practicality and the future. Ruby was precise about finances in the way of someone who had learned to be through necessity, and Tobias was less precise but teachable, and they arrived at a system that was functional and felt like a partnership, because it was. They argued about one other thing, which was whether to invite any of Ruby's people. She had a sister in Kansas, younger, named Ada, who she had not seen since leaving Linden in February of the previous year. She had written to Ada twice since arriving in Dusty Creek but not received a reply, and she did not know if the letters had arrived or if Ada was not in a position to write back, and the not knowing had a specific quality of pain to it. Tobias wrote the letter himself to Ada Breckenridge, Ruby's sister, in Linden, Kansas, at the address Ruby gave him from memory. He told Ada in plain terms that her sister was well and happy in New Mexico territory, and was getting married in October, and would like very much for Ada to attend if she was able and safe to do so. A reply came in September, forwarded through the Linden post office, written in a hand more hurried than careful. Ada was well. She had received Ruby's letters. She had not replied because she did not know what to say and because their father had told her not to. She was coming to New Mexico. She had been waiting for a reason, and this was a reason. Ruby read the letter at the kitchen table of what was now their house, and cried in the way of someone who has not let themselves cry about a thing for a very long time, which was not comfortable but was clearly necessary. And Tobias sat beside her and did not try to make it stop or better, just put his hand on her back and let her get to the other side of it. Ada Breckenridge arrived on a Thursday morning in early October, 3 weeks before the wedding. She was 23, slight like Ruby but softer around the edges, with the same dark hair and her sister's eyes in a rounder face. She stepped off the train with a large carpet bag and looked around the platform and saw Ruby, and they moved toward each other and embraced in the middle of the platform with a completeness that made Tobias, who had come with Ruby to meet her, Look away at the middle distance for a moment. Ada stayed with Mrs. Hartwell, who had been deeply invested in this wedding from approximately 15 minutes after Tobias asked Ruby, and had since been engaged in a level of organizational activity that the town of Dusty Creek could only stand back and admire. Ada fit into the inn like she had always been there, gentle and practical, and she and Ruby spent the evenings of those 3 weeks talking in Ruby's room in the way of sisters who have a great deal of time to account for. They were married on the 19th of October, 1882, a Saturday, in the church of Dusty Creek under a sky that had gone the particular clear deep blue of a high desert autumn. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Caleb Mount, who was 40 and patient, and who appreciated that the couple had specific views about certain traditional language and had quietly agreed to modify the ceremony accordingly, specifically the portion about obedience, which he left out without being asked twice. Mrs. Hartwell was there in a hat that featured more ribbon than strictly necessary and cried from the opening prayer. Denny Marsh attended and wore his good boots. Dale Ruiz was there with his wife and Mrs. Fay with her husband, and Hector Ruiz in a collar that was clearly uncomfortable, and 11 members of the Wednesday reading circle, and old Perkins, the fiddle player who played something before the ceremony that was not a hymn but was beautiful. Ellis Conroy rode down from the ranch, arriving Friday evening with Miguel Ruiz, who was exploring what the territory south of the family land looked like. And Ellis had his brother's dark eyes and his mother's particular quality of warmth that came out sideways in dry remarks at unexpected moments. He shook Ruby's hand on Friday evening and said, "He talked about you for the entire 5 days he rode back from the ranch in May. I want you to know that, the whole 5 days." Ruby turned to look at Tobias with an expression of entirely delighted betrayal. "Did he?" "I talked about the landscape," Tobias said. "He talked about you," Ellis said firmly. Ada walked Ruby up the aisle, which was not traditional, and nobody said a word about it, or if they did they said it quietly enough that it did not reach either bride or groom. Tobias stood at the front of the church in a good coat he had bought in Cimarron on a trip the previous month, and he watched Ruby walk toward him with Ada at her side, and the autumn light coming through the church windows. And he thought that he had been going nowhere for a very long time and had somehow arrived here, at this particular church on this particular day, and that whatever he had been looking for in the 3 years since his father died and the 2 years since his mother died. It was not the ranch, and it was not the road, and it had, apparently, been waiting for him on the platform of a noon train in April. The ceremony was short and real. The vows were their own words, which they had written together at the kitchen table 2 weeks before, and when Tobias said his and Ruby said hers, they were both looking at each other rather than at the Reverend and the church and all the people in it, and it felt private in the best sense, like something happening between exactly the 2 people it concerned. After, the town gathered in the square behind the church, and Perkins played, and there was food and dancing, and a quantity of goodwill that made Dusty Creek feel briefly enormous in the way small places can when they contain something worth celebrating. Ellis danced with Ada, which nobody had planned, and they talked for a long time, and this was something Tobias noticed and filed away without making any comment. Ada was 23 and Ellis was 24, and whatever they were talking about kept them in each other's orbit for the entire evening. And when the dancing wound down and Ada was going back to the inn, Ellis appeared to have somehow found himself walking her there despite the fact that his accommodation for the evening was at the other end of town. Tobias mentioned this to Ruby as they walked back to their own house in the late evening, and Ruby said she had noticed, and they both decided they were not going to interfere, and also that they were going to pay attention. The winter of 1882 into 1883 settled over Dusty Creek with the courtesy that New Mexico winters occasionally managed, cold but not brutal, with enough clear days between the cold ones to make it livable. Tobias continued his carpentry work, which had grown into something that required taking on a young apprentice named Oscar, who was 16 and eager, and not yet skilled but improving steadily. Ruby continued the school through the winter term and the reading circle, and in January she began teaching a small class in arithmetic to 4 women in town who had decided they wanted to understand their household accounts with more precision, which she ran on Tuesday afternoons and which was, she reported to Tobias in the evenings, both useful and frequently funny because the women were formidable, and the arithmetic was not a match for them once they turned their full attention to it. They had adjusted to each other in the way of 2 people who had both been alone in their own particular ways and were learning, with varying degrees of grace, to be present in someone else's daily life. There were things that required navigation. Ruby had a strong preference for silence in the mornings before 9 o'clock, which Tobias had not known was possible for another person to need so completely, and which he now respected absolutely. Tobias had a tendency to leave work projects in stages of incompletion in the main room of the house, which Ruby had a strong feeling about, and they arrived at a system involving a particular corner of the room that was designated as a work area, and which she agreed to treat as its own separate territory. They were happy. It was not the happiness of no difficulty or no history. It was the harder kind that is built on accurate knowledge of each other and chosen anyway. In February, Ada wrote a letter from Linden, Kansas, that was 6 pages long and came in 2 envelopes. She was writing to Ruby but had also included a separate sealed note for Ellis, and she asked if Ruby could forward it. Ruby held the sealed note for Ellis and looked at it and then at Tobias and said, "What do you think?" "I think she has written him a letter," Tobias said. "He has written her 3, Ruby said. "I know," Tobias said. Ellis had mentioned it in a way that was elaborately casual. "I think you should send it." The letter was forwarded to the ranch. 2 weeks later Ellis wrote to Tobias and did not mention Ada at all, which was a form of mention that Tobias understood completely. Spring came back to Dusty Creek with the reliable generosity of the desert's brief green season, and Ruby's wildflower book came back out of the winter shelf, and they rode out on Sundays again with Calla and the borrowed livery mare, and Ruby had learned enough about the flowers that she was beginning to identify things before she needed the book. On a Sunday in early April, almost exactly a year after she had stepped off the noon train, they rode east until the town was behind a rise of scrubby hills, and the land opened up into the particular silence that only the wide territories can manage, and they dismounted and sat on a flat rock in the warm spring sun with the scrub in bloom around them, purple verbena and yellow brittlebush, and the improbable pink of a hedgehog cactus nearby. Ruby leaned back on her hands and looked at the sky. She had a quality in moments like this, a quality of rest that was not laziness, a sense of someone who has set down what they were carrying and can feel the unclenching of the muscles that had held it. "A year ago," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow is the 14th. She turned her head to look at him. "Are you keeping track?" "I remember the day," he said. "It is hard to forget." She sat up. She looked at her hands in her lap and then at him with a directness that meant she was going to say something real. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I am going to have a baby," she said. "In September, I think. Mrs. Hartwell suspects, and she is probably right." He did not say anything for a moment because there was no immediate container for what he felt, which was large and a little frightening and entirely joyful, and those 3 things were too large to come out in any orderly fashion. "Ruby," he said. "I know," she said. "It is a lot." "No," he said. "I mean, yes, it is a lot, but I mean—" He stopped. He reached over and took both her hands in his, turning so he was fully facing her. "I am so glad," he said. "That is what I mean. I am so glad." She exhaled and her whole face changed, the careful watching dropping away into something open and bright, and she laughed. And there it was again, that full, unguarded laugh that he had first heard in the schoolhouse in May of the previous year and had been living on since. "I was not sure how you would," she began. "I am glad," he said again, firmly. "I am entirely glad." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the flat rock in the spring desert with the verbena and the brittlebush and the improbable cactus pink. and the sky was the blue that had been there a year ago when the train came in trailing smoke, and the world was large and specific and theirs. He sent a letter to Ellis that afternoon. Ellis wrote back by return mail in a response that was 3 sentences long and contained the words "Congratulations," "About time," and Miguel's wife had a boy in February which he had forgotten to mention. Tobias read the letter to Ruby and she laughed, and wrote a longer reply that actually addressed all the relevant points. The summer of 1883 was hotter than the previous one, and Ruby continued teaching through the full summer term, despite Mrs. Hartwell's gentle suggestions to the contrary, because Ruby had strong opinions about continuity for the children, and because she was, as she told Tobias with considerable tranquility, having a baby not an illness, and she was perfectly capable of standing in front of a classroom until September. She did accept, in August, when the heat was at its most serious, Tobias's installation of a second shade awning over the east window, and the addition of a proper water pump closer to the school, so she did not have to carry the bucket so far. She stopped teaching 2 weeks before the baby arrived, which happened on the 12th of September, 1883, in their house on the south end of Dusty Creek with Mrs. Hartwell attending, and the doctor from the next town over, a capable man named Dr. Sorensen, who arrived with 4 hours to spare, and for whom Tobias was profoundly grateful. The labor was long and difficult enough to terrify Tobias, who was sent out of the room and stood on the porch through most of it listening to sounds from inside that made every minute feel like an hour. The baby was a boy. He arrived loud and red and entirely healthy, and Mrs. Hartwell came to the porch door and said, "You have a son," with the expression of someone delivering news they consider personally wonderful, and Tobias went inside. Ruby was tired in the specific way of someone who has done something enormous, and she had the baby in her arms, and she looked up when Tobias came in with an expression he had not seen before on her face, something stripped entirely of the careful guard she had spent years constructing, something purely present. "Come and see him," she said. He came and saw him, and the baby was small and had dark hair and was not doing much yet, which Dr. Sorensen assured them was appropriate for someone approximately 40 minutes old. "What do we call him?" Tobias said. Ruby looked at the baby. "I have been thinking about James," she said, "for no particular reason except that I like it." She paused. "James William. William for your father if you want." Tobias looked at his son, who was James William Conroy, and felt his father's absence and his presence simultaneously in a way he had not managed before, the grief and the continuity of it, the way love persists through the shapes of things. "James William," he said. "Yes." Ada arrived in October, having written that she wanted to meet her nephew, and she arrived not alone but with Ellis, who had apparently offered to escort her down from the north, and had not been corrected in this ambition. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon together on horseback, Ellis on his road horse and Ada on a borrowed animal from the ranch, and the way they arrived, side by side and talking comfortably, said most of what needed to be said about the previous winter's correspondence. Ruby and Ada were in the kitchen when they arrived, and Tobias was on the porch with James, who was a month old and currently regarding the middle distance with the serious attention of someone who has a great deal to figure out. Ellis dismounted and tied his horse and came up the porch steps and looked at the baby. He had not met him yet. He stood for a moment with a look on his face that Tobias recognized because it had been on his own face a month ago. "He looks like father," Ellis said. "I know," Tobias said. "He also makes the same expression Mother used to make when she was deciding something." Ellis laughed, which was the particular sound of someone laughing at something that hurts pleasantly. He reached out and let the baby grip his finger, which the baby did with conviction. "Hello, James," Ellis said. "I am your uncle. I will teach you to work cattle as soon as your uncle on the other side of this door lets me get near you." "I can hear you," Ruby called from inside. Ellis grinned and looked at Tobias. "I like her." "I know," Tobias said. "I told you." Ada appeared in the doorway and came to meet James with a soft expression and careful hands, and Ellis appeared beside her with a naturalness that was not performed. And Tobias watched his brother stand beside Ruby's sister in the October afternoon, and understood that the dinner table in this house was going to be full of interesting conversations for the foreseeable future. They stayed a week, Ellis and Ada, and in that week the house on the south end of Dusty Creek was louder and warmer and fuller than it had been, and Tobias found himself falling asleep on the fourth night of their stay in a house full of the sounds of people, Ruby breathing beside him and James in the cradle at the foot of the bed, and the voices of his brother and her sister from the main room, where they were still talking at an hour that suggested they had a great deal more to say than they had yet managed. And he lay in the dark and thought about the platform a year and a half ago, the loose plank, the leather satchel, the woman with the sage-green eyes who had looked at the town of Dusty Creek like she was cataloging escape routes. He thought about what she had said to him once in the summer when he had asked her if she thought her life had been inevitable, if she thought all of it had led to this. She had considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. "I do not think anything is inevitable," she had said. "I think we made choices and the choices made other choices possible. I think I got on a train and you were on the platform and you could have not caught me and I could have gotten up myself and gone a different direction. I think we chose each other in every single small step along the way." He believed her. He had been choosing this in every small step, choosing to stay on the platform instead of walking away, choosing to walk her across the main street, choosing to come back from the ranch, choosing to knock on the schoolhouse door. Every step had been a choice, and the accumulation of them was his life as it now was, which was a life he would not have exchanged for any other. The winter of 1883 was cold and good. James grew at the pace that babies grow, which is simultaneously too fast and miraculous, and he proved himself to be a person of strong opinions early on, which Ruby said with satisfaction came from his father and Tobias said with equal satisfaction came from his mother. Mrs. Hartwell spent approximately half her available time in their house, which was not unwelcome, and the reading circle had grown to 17 members and met on both Wednesdays and Thursdays now. In December, a letter came from Ada in Linden, written on good paper, which said that she was leaving Kansas in the spring and that she wondered if Dusty Creek needed a seamstress, having learned from Mrs. Fay, who she had met in October, that the town had room for one. The letter was written to Ruby, but the postscript was addressed to Tobias and Ellis jointly and said, "I realize this requires your input, particularly as Ellis has expressed strong feelings on the subject of my proximity, and I would appreciate knowing what those feelings are in a more formal and direct way, as I am not the sort of woman who arrives in a town without understanding her circumstances." Ellis came down from the ranch in January to visit James, which was the stated reason, and he brought with him a letter he had written and asked Tobias to read before he sent it. The letter to Ada was not long, but it was honest in the way Ellis was honest when he let himself be, and it said, among other things, that he intended to ask her a question when she arrived in the spring and wanted her to be prepared for it. Tobias read it and handed it back and said, "It is a good letter." Ellis folded it. "She is a forthright person." "She is," Tobias agreed. "Ruby says she has been that way since she was small. She does not do things by half." Ellis smiled in a private way. "No," he said, "she does not. Ada arrived in April on a train with rather more luggage than Ruby had arrived with 2 Aprils ago. She came off the train onto the platform, which had been repaired in the previous summer finally by Cecil the station master, with purpose and composure, and Ellis was there to meet her, which he had ridden 3 days to do, and Tobias and Ruby stood a discreet distance back with James in Ruby's arms. What passed between Ellis and Ada on the platform Tobias could not entirely hear, but he saw the moment it happened, Ellis saying something that made Ada look at him with a directness that was entirely her own, and her answer, whatever it was, making Ellis Conroy, 25 years old and practical in most things, break into a smile that Tobias had not seen on his brother's face since they were boys running across the ranch in summer. Ruby leaned close and said quietly, "She said yes." "I assumed," Tobias said. "She told him he had better have a real home ready because she was not living in a bunkhouse," Ruby added. Tobias laughed. James, at the sound, turned his solemn face toward the direction of the laugh and regarded his father with the gravity of a 7-month-old who has not yet decided what to make of merriment. The spring and summer of 1884 arranged themselves with the pleasant busyness of two families in the process of becoming. Ada set up her dressmaking work in a small shop space that Tobias built out of a back portion of the hardware store where Martha Hollies, who had long since become one of Ruby's Tuesday arithmetic students and had a good head for business, helped her negotiate a fair rate. The shop did well from the first month, because Ada was skilled and because the women of Dusty Creek had been waiting for exactly this kind of resource. Ellis came south regularly, first monthly and then more often as it became apparent that the ranch under Miguel's capable co-management did not need his daily presence, and that his presence in Dusty Creek had become meaningful in a way that 2 years ago he could not have planned. He and Ada were married quietly in June, in the same church where Tobias and Ruby had been married, with a smaller gathering and Perkins playing the same sweet not-quite hymn from his barrel outside. Tobias stood up as witness for his brother and Ruby stood up for her sister, and James, almost a year old by then and recently mobile in ways that required constant attention, was held throughout the ceremony by Hector Ruiz, who at 11 had appointed himself unofficial junior caretaker of the Conroy baby, with a seriousness that his mother found both touching and somewhat alarming. Ellis and Ada, after their marriage, spent the summer in Dusty Creek and the fall moving between there and the ranch, working out a pattern that suited them, which turned out to be winters at the ranch when Ada could not travel easily and springs and summers in Dusty Creek where the shop was. The ranch ran well under this arrangement because Miguel and his wife and their small son had made it a home of their own and treated it accordingly, and Ellis was freed to be in 2 places as the seasons demanded. James Conroy turned 1 year old in September of 1884, and the celebration was at the house on the south end, and it included more people than the house could strictly contain, and spilled out onto the porch and into the yard, and Perkins came and played in the yard because he had taken a liking to the family, and because Ada had mended his coat the previous winter, and he felt a debt of general goodwill toward her and her people. Tobias stood at the edge of his yard on that September afternoon, in the angle between the house and the fence where the light came in from the west in the warm gold of late afternoon, and he looked at what was in his yard. There was his son, who was sitting in the dirt with the focused concentration of someone who has recently discovered that dirt is endlessly interesting. There was Ruby, talking to Mrs. Hartwell near the porch steps, her head tilted back slightly in the laugh that he knew by now as well as his own breathing. There was Ada with her hands moving as she talked, the way they always moved, and Ellis beside her with the look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. There was Dale Ruiz and his wife, and Mrs. Fay with her husband, and Hector standing near James with one eye on the baby and one on the table where the food was, and Mrs. Hartwell's hat with its considerable ribbon, and Denny Marsh with his good boots on, and the whole small sufficient world of it. He thought about standing on the platform of this very town 2.5 years ago with a telegram in his breast pocket about a ranch he could not face and a future he could not see. He thought about the train coming in with its smoke and its sound, and the woman stepping down onto the platform with her leather satchel and her secrets and her steadiness. He thought about catching her when she fell on the loose plank and walking her across the street with its poorly marked drainage ditch and learning her name. Ruby Beckett, she had said, and the name had fallen between them like a coin on a hard floor, clear and final, and it had been the beginning of everything. He thought about the schoolhouse in May and the lamp and the moth. He thought about the dance in April and the firelight and the third song. He thought about her face in the churchlight on the 19th of October, walking toward him with Ada at her side, and the vows they had written themselves at the kitchen table, and the way she had looked at him when she said them, direct and unguarded and entirely chosen. He looked at his son sitting in the dirt of his yard in the September afternoon. He looked at his brother laughing with his wife. He looked at Ruby, who chose that moment to look across the yard at him, and who, finding him watching her, raised an eyebrow in the way that said she knew exactly what he was doing and was not opposed to it. He crossed the yard to her. She turned from Mrs. Hartwell to face him, and he took her hand, and she squeezed his, and he stood beside her in the warmth of the afternoon, with the fiddle music in the yard, and the sounds of people who had become his people, and thought about the cowboy with no future who had stood on a platform in April of 1882 waiting for nothing. He had been wrong about having no future. He had simply not been able to see it yet from where he was standing. The future, it turned out, had arrived on the noon train. The years that followed in Dusty Creek were ones that built with the steady accumulation of a life well made. Ruby taught through the fall of 1885, and then, when their second child arrived in January of 1886, a daughter with Ruby's eyes and Tobias's stubborn jaw, who they named Clara after Ruby's grandmother. She took a term away, and then came back to the school with Clara, in a bassinet in the corner that Mrs. Hartwell had outfitted with such thoroughness that the children of the school treated the baby as something between a class mascot and a pet, which Clara, who was an equable infant, tolerated well. James, at 2.5, treated his sister with the proprietary interest of someone who has decided a new person is theirs by default, and the combination of his seriousness and her equability produced a sibling dynamic that made their parents laugh often. Tobias's carpentry work had evolved by 1886 into something more structured. He had taken on a second apprentice alongside Oscar, and he had built 3 new houses in Dusty Creek for families arriving from the east and from the south, and he had a reputation in the surrounding territory that brought occasional commissions from other towns. He was not wealthy, but he was not worried, and the house on the south end had been extended and improved until it was genuinely comfortable, with a second room for the children and a study for Ruby where she kept her books and her papers for the school, and did her planning in the morning quiet that she still required before 9 o'clock. The injustice of her pay relative to the previous teachers had been resolved finally in 1885, not through the town council, but through the practical mechanism of the school board, which was constituted separately, and which contained Mrs. Hartwell and Mrs. Ruiz, and which simply voted the salary to match what the position deserved. Garrett Hollies objected on the board and was outvoted 4-1, and went home to be firmly addressed by his wife Martha, who had by this time completed 2 full years of Ruby's Tuesday arithmetic instruction, and had accordingly reorganized the store's entire accounting system in ways that were significantly more profitable. The matter was not raised again. Dale Ruiz's oldest daughter, Alina, became Ruby's assistant teacher in 1886 at the age of 19, and showed every sign of being as good at it as Ruby herself, which Ruby told Tobias with unconcealed satisfaction one evening, that she had found someone to love the work the same way she did. Ellis and Ada had their own news in 1886, a son born in March at the ranch, where they had been for the winter, and named Samuel, and he was brought down to Dusty Creek in May for James and Clara to meet, and immediately regarded by James as his deputy in the ongoing management of the world, which Samuel, who was agreeable, did not seem to mind. Life in the territory in those years was not without its difficulties. The politics of New Mexico in the 1880s were complicated by questions of statehood, and by the ongoing displacement and mistreatment of the native peoples of the land, a fact that was not abstract in Dusty Creek, which was close enough to areas of Apache territory that it was real and present in the conversations of those years. Tobias and Ruby talked about it honestly, which was more than many in the town did. Ruby added a unit to the school curriculum about the history of the territory that included acknowledgement of the people who had been there before the settlements, which caused one heated meeting of the school board and was ultimately permitted because Mrs. Hartwell said she thought it was appropriate, and nobody had successfully argued with Mrs. Hartwell in 20 years of trying. By the autumn of 1887, 5 years after Ruby had stepped off the noon train, Dusty Creek had grown. New families had come. A doctor had settled permanently so that Dr. Sorensen no longer needed to be summoned from the next town. A second general store had opened on the north end, which caused Garrett Hollies a great deal of agitation and caused his wife Martha a great deal of useful competitive motivation. The school had enough children now that there was talk of building a second classroom, which Tobias was already designing in his head without waiting for the town council to make it official. Ruby was 30 years old in 1887. She stood on the porch of their house on the south end of Dusty Creek on an October evening, the 5th anniversary of their marriage, while the children slept inside, and the autumn air had the clean, cold edge that made the stars visible in a particular way. Tobias had made supper, which he had gotten considerably better at over 5 years of practice, and Mrs. Hartwell had sent a cake because Mrs. Hartwell marked every anniversary of every person she cared about, and she cared about a great deal of people. Ruby leaned on the porch rail and looked at the stars. Tobias stood beside her. They had the comfortable silence of people who have spent enough time together that the silences are as communicative as the words. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I would tell the person I was in February of 1882 if I could." "What would you tell her?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. The Milky Way was visible, the long, cold sweep of it across the dark. "I would tell her to get on the train," she said. "I would tell her that Dusty Creek has a loose plank on the platform, but someone will catch her, and that the catching is the beginning of something." She paused. "I would tell her that it is worth being afraid and going anyway. That on the other side of the afraid is a life she cannot imagine from where she is standing." He looked at her profile in the starlight. At 30, she was the same person she had been when she stepped off the train, and more so. The same steadiness and the same directness and the same complicated sage-green eyes and the particular courage of someone who chose things deliberately. She had chosen this life. She continued choosing it. He knew the difference between someone who was in a life because they had no other options and someone who was in it because they wanted it and she wanted it, and the knowledge of that was something he would never take for granted. "What would you tell yourself?" she asked, turning to look at him. He thought about the platform, about the telegram in his pocket and the boot propped against the post, and the sense of a man whose future was somewhere behind him. "I would tell myself to stay on the platform," he said. "To not walk away before the last car." He looked at her. "And I would tell myself that catching someone is not just about the catching. It is about everything that comes after." She smiled at him, and it was the full smile, the real one, the one he had first seen in the schoolhouse on a rainy May evening when she was surrounded by her chalk and her children's drawings and her careful life, and it had not diminished in 5 years of seeing it. It was exactly the same, and it was better, because it was familiar now, and familiar was the word for what you love so much you have made it part of your own understanding of the world. He reached over and took her hand on the porch rail, and she laced her fingers through his. The stars were enormous over New Mexico, over the high desert and the scrub hills and the cottonwoods, along the watercourses and the red rock and the sage, and over the town of Dusty Creek with its repaired platform planks, and its schoolhouse with the 2 awnings and its hardware store, and its general store and its church, and the house on the south end with the light in the windows, and the children asleep inside, and the 2 people on the porch who had found each other in the particular accidental decisive way that changes everything. Inside, James Conroy, aged 4, was not quite asleep, but was pretending to be in the conscientious way he had of managing the world's expectations. Clara Conroy, 22 months, was genuinely and completely asleep with the uncompromising thoroughness of the young. Their parents were on the porch. The lamp was on in the study where Ruby's books were, and the lamp was on in the kitchen where the supper things were still on the table, and the cake from Mrs. Hartwell sat half-eaten on the counter, and the wildflower book was on the shelf where it always was, spine out, between a geography text and a collection of poetry Ruby had ordered from Santa Fe. There was nothing unresolved. There was nothing waiting to be addressed that had not been addressed. There were only the ongoing daily choices that made up a life, and two people who had learned to make them together, and the stars over New Mexico doing what they had always done, which was to be enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and to shine equally on every person who happened to be standing under them and looking up. Ruby squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. "Come inside," she said. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," he said. She knew him well enough to know a minute meant exactly a minute, so she stayed. They stood on the porch in the cold October air looking at the stars for another minute, and then Tobias Conroy, who had once been a cowboy with no future standing on a platform in a town he had no reason to be in, opened the door and followed his wife inside. The lamplight was warm and the cake was on the counter, and the children were sleeping and the night outside was full of stars, and the door closed behind them with the quiet, solid sound of a life fully inhabited, fully lived, and entirely their own.